Benvinguts, welcome back to a new knighthood. Last episode we looked at France circa 1100, a kingdom in fragments where a weak crown sat atop duchies and counties that answered largely to themselves. Today we cross the Pyrenees to the Iberian Peninsula. Iberian 1100 was not politically plural in the way France was. It was plural all the way down. 3 faiths, many languages, competing political systems, with contested ground on every frontier. But before we begin, if these episodes are useful to you, please like, subscribe and comment below. I like hearing your thoughts. And also remember to turn on notifications so you know when a new video is up. Plurality, not coexistence, not tolerance. Those words are too smooth for the situation in Iberia the year 1100. The modern centralized countries of Spain and Portugal didn't exist yet. Plurality meant genuine difference, pressed into the same space, negotiating its boundaries every day. Iberia held 3 faiths: Christianity, Islam and Judaism. It held languages from several different families: Catalan, Occitan, Castilian, Leonese, Galician, Arabic, Hebrew, Basque, Berber, Mozarabic Romance, and various other vernaculars. It held competing political systems, with Christian kingdoms consolidating in the north and Muslim Taifa states fragmenting in the south. And all of it was contested ground. The so-called Reconquista, the Christian reconquest, was active. This was not peaceful multiculturalism, this was plurality under pressure. And yet the conflict produced an extraordinary cultural flowering. Arabic science and Greek philosophy made their way into Latin Europe. Sephardic Jewish scholars mediated between traditions, moving knowledge across boundaries that looked impassable from outside. Cultural exchange happened despite, and sometimes because of, the political tensions. Today we're exploring what it takes to hold plurality, to engage with radically different systems of thought without losing your center or destroying the other. It's a rare capacity, and a fragile one. Iberia shows us both what makes it possible, and why it so seldom survives under pressure. Let us establish the political situation in 1100, because who controls what matters for understanding how this plurality functioned. In the northeast lay the county of Barcelona, ruled by Ramon Berenguer III. Barcelona wasn't a kingdom yet, it was a county, technically under the overlordship of the French crown, though that was largely theoretical by this point. Ramon Berenguer held lands on both sides of the Pyrenees. Through lineage and language, his court belonged to the same cultural world as Toulouse and Narbonne. Catalan and Occitan were sister languages, mutually intelligible. The troubadour world we discussed in the Bājja episode ran directly through Barcelona. This was one cultural sphere, stretching from Catalonia through the Pyrenees into southern France. But Ramon Berenguer was also conducting warfare against Muslim territories to the south and west, expanding, taking towns, extracting tribute from weaker Taifa kingdoms. So he was navigating between 2 worlds, the refined Occitan courtly culture to the north, with its concepts of Bājja, and violent frontier warfare to the south. Just west of Barcelona lay the Kingdom of Aragon. In 1100 it was ruled by Pedro I, who was also King of Pamplona, the heartland of the old Kingdom of Navarra. This small realm had been partitioned between Aragon and Castilla-Leon in 1076. Aragon held Pamplona until Navarra broke free again in 1134. Pedro's brother Alfonso, later known as Alfonso I the Battler, would take the throne in 1104, after Pedro's young son predeceased him. Alfonso was a warrior king and would define the kingdom's character for a generation. He would capture Saragossa in 1118, conduct deep raids into Muslim territory, and expand Aragon aggressively southward. He represented the militarized frontier mentality, less interested in courtly refinement and more focused on conquest and expansion. Barcelona and Aragon were separate powers in 1100. They were neighbours, sometimes allies, sometimes competitors. They wouldn't unite until 1137 when Ramon Berenguer IV of Barcelona married Petronilla of Aragon. In 1100 they were distinct political entities with different priorities and different styles. Further west lay Castilla y León, a personal union of the kingdoms of León, Castilla and Galicia. Alfonso VI ruled from Toledo, which he had captured in 1085. That conquest shifted the balance of power in Iberia. Toledo had been one of the great cities of Al-Andalus, very culturally sophisticated, famous for its libraries and scholars. When Alfonso took it, he made a crucial decision. He preserved much of this infrastructure and allowed Muslim and Jewish populations to remain. Toledo would grow into a great translation center in the 12th century under Archbishop Raimon and his successors. The foundations for this were laid by this decision in 1085. On the Atlantic coast within Alfonso's realm sat the county of Portugal, which would break away in the 1140s and grow into the Kingdom of Portugal. In Muslim Iberia, Al-Andalus, the situation was fragmented. The unified Caliphate of Cordoba had collapsed in 1031, breaking into dozens of Taifa kingdoms, independent city-states of varying sizes. Zaragoza, Valencia, Sevilla, Granada, Badajoz. They were all vital places, centers of poetry, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. Ibn Saidun was writing love poetry in Cordoba. Ibn Hazm was writing on the theory of love and on comparative religion. These courts produced the philosophical and scientific work that Ibn Gabirol, Ibn Bājja, and later figures would build on. This was cultural life of the highest order. The Taifas were militarily weak and were often at war with each other, and they paid tribute, called parias, to Christian kings to avoid conquest. This tribute enriched the Christian kingdoms and helped fund their expansion. The Taifas couldn't defend themselves indefinitely. In 1086, facing mounting Christian pressure, they made a fateful decision. They called for help from the Almoravids, a Berber dynasty from North Africa that had unified Morocco in the preceding decades under a strict reformist version of Islam. The Almoravids crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, defeated Alfonso VI at the Battle of Sagrajas, and stabilized the military situation. But they didn't just help and leave. They started absorbing the Taifa kingdoms into their own empire, and they brought with them a harder, more puritanical form of Sunni Islam. In their view, the Taifas court's poetry, wine, music, and easy mixing with Christians and Jews was decadence to be purified. This was the view of ascetic outsiders looking in on a civilization producing real beauty and real thought. They came to purify as much as to defend. So by 1100, Christian kingdoms were expanding, but were still relatively weak compared to what they would become. Muslim territories were fragmented, but now backed by Almoravid military power and increasingly rigid religious orthodoxy. And caught between these hardening boundaries were populations that had been living in this mixed environment for generations. Mozarabs were Christians living under Muslim rule, speaking Arabic and participating in Islamic culture. Mudehars were Muslims living under Christian rule after conquest. The Sephardic Jews lived along that whole spectrum, Arabic speaking in Al-Andalus, where they shared their Muslim neighbors' Andalusi Arabic, Romance speaking in the Christian north, where they spoke whatever their Christian neighbors spoke, with Hebrew and Aramaic as their own languages of prayer and learning. That stacked multilingualism made them indispensable as translators, physicians, and financial administrators for Christian and Muslim lords alike, moving between worlds because they had to. This was the political reality around 1100, contested, unstable, and increasingly violent. And yet somehow, in the spaces between these conflicts, productive exchange continued. What did plurality actually look like on the ground? It was not abstract tolerance, but specific arrangements, specific practices. The Spanish term is convivencia, meaning living together. It is often romanticized now, presented as some kind of medieval multiculturalism, a golden age of tolerance. The reality was more complicated and more interesting than that. In cities like Barcelona, Toledo, and Zaragoza, it was common to see separate legal systems for each religious community, be it Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. Each community had significant internal autonomy, managing its own affairs under its own authorities. But they were all nested within a larger political structure, usually Christian in the north by 1100 and Muslim in most of the south. There was clear economic interdependence. Muslims often worked in agriculture and various crafts. They had the agricultural knowledge and the technical skills that Christian conquerors often lacked. Jews dominated certain specialized trades: medicine, finance, translation, and tax collection. These were roles that required literacy, numerical skill, and often the ability to move between Christian and Muslim contexts. Christians controlled military power and the apparatus of governance, in the north at least. This wasn't equality. There were clear hierarchies in both Christian and Muslim territories. Religious minorities paid special taxes and faced various legal restrictions, whether Muslims and Jews under Christian rule or Christians and Jews under Muslim rule. But there was also mutual need. There was also intellectual exchange. The translation work that would help transform European thought was not fully organized in 1100, but its conditions were already in place. When that work matured, here's how it typically proceeded. A Jewish scholar might have Arabic as a mother tongue, Hebrew and Aramaic as the languages of religious learning, and Latin or Romance vernacular as the bridge to Christian scholarship. He would take an Arabic text, Aristotle as preserved and commented on by Muslim philosophers like Ibn Sina or Ibn Rushd, and translate it, often in collaboration with a Christian scholar, sometimes with a third figure bridging vernaculars. These weren't casual collaborations. They required deep knowledge of multiple intellectual systems, not just languages, but entire conceptual frameworks, different ways of thinking about philosophy, science, and theology. You couldn't translate Al-Farabi's commentary on Aristotle without understanding Greek philosophy as it had developed, Islamic theological and philosophical debates, and the Christian scholastic categories that would receive this work. You had to think across traditions. You had to hold multiple frameworks in your mind simultaneously and see how concepts in one system might map onto concepts in another, or where they fundamentally diverged. This is the challenge plurality imposes. To do this work effectively, you have to understand the other tradition well enough to work with it, its eternal logic, its assumptions, its methods, what problems it's trying to solve. But you also have to maintain your own center, your own framework for evaluation. Too much permeability and you dissolve into confusion. You can see every perspective but can't choose between them. Too much rigidity and you can't engage at all, but reject everything outside your tradition as error or threat. This capacity didn't appear from nowhere. It was trained. Translators worked in lineages. Physicians studied under masters. Merchants learned from older merchants how to hold several frames at once and trade across all of them. Squires learned from experienced knights. The skill of moving between worlds without losing yourself was passed down deliberately, because most people left to themselves and pressed hard enough collapsed to one side or the other. So why did this arrangement, for all the creativity it produced, eventually collapse? External military pressure is part of the answer. The Almoravid intervention in 1086 stabilized Muslim defenses, but brought a less tolerant form of Islam, one that viewed the cultural mixing of Al-Andalus as a problem. Later the Almohads would be even more rigid, embracing Mahdism, the eschatological belief in a great Islamic redeemer. On the Christian side, the crusading ideology that emerged after 1095 hardened the religious dimension of warfare. What had been primarily about territory, tribute, and political power was increasingly framed as holy war. Plurality became hard to justify once both sides had begun to see the conflict in zero-sum religious terms. As the boundaries hardened, two ways of refusing plurality took hold. The first was refusal to engage at all. The other tradition was declared in error, a form of corruption, something to be purified rather than understood. The Almoravids and Almohads brought this from the south, while the crusading frontier supplied its Christian mirror in the north. The second was more cynical, knowledge of the other kept and used, but only as a weapon. Christian rulers who employed Jewish advisors for their command of Arabic and their grasp of Muslim politics leaned on that expertise for diplomacy and intelligence, and then expelled or forcibly converted the same communities once they became inconvenient. The knowledge was real, the respect was not. Jews, caught between the hardening identities, were the most exposed to both. Internal political dynamics pushed the same way. As Christian kingdoms conquered more territory, they needed Muslim populations less than before, and the economic interdependence that had sustained convivencia weakened. A small kingdom living off tribute needed its Muslim neighbors intact and productive. And there was something psychological underneath all of it. The sheer exhaustion of holding complexity. Each generation had to choose plurality again, deliberately, and the choice was costly. It took constant negotiation, constant translation, constant attention to boundaries and relationships. It was far simpler, both administratively and in the mind, to collapse into a single identity, a single system, a single truth. Eventually, the whole arrangement collapsed into enforced simplicity, partially because external pressure loomed once again. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Iberian kingdoms became increasingly concerned that Andalusian Muslims would conspire with the rising power of the Ottoman Turks, then spreading into Europe and across the Mediterranean. In 1492, Fernando and Isabel, the Catholic monarchs of a combined Aragon and Castilla-León, completed the Reconquista with the fall of Granada, and the Alhambra decree expelled the Jews. Muslims got the convert or leave ultimatum in stages afterward, first in Portugal in 1496-97, followed by Castilla-León in 1501-02, and then finally Aragon in 1525-26. The Moriscos, those who had converted, were finally expelled between 1609 and 1614. An inquisition, established in 1478, policed the converts suspected of not having truly converted. Across roughly a century, the Iberian kingdoms became rigidly, exclusively Catholic. The plurality was gone. What the kingdoms gained in uniformity they paid for over time. The extraordinary creativity that had come from the friction between traditions, the kind that had made Al-Andalus and the frontier zones remarkable, did not survive the elimination of those traditions. We are living through our own version of this pattern. We live in a plural, globalized world with unprecedented religious diversity. But we also face ideological and informational plurality that medieval Iberians never experienced. We have access to more perspectives, more frameworks, more competing narratives than any previous generation. Multiple traditions of thought are colliding, forced into proximity through technology and globalization. We feel the same pressure towards simplification. Some people collapse into relativism, where there's no center at all, everything equally valid, all perspectives dissolving into a confusion where you can't choose or act. Others collapse into fundamentalism, rigid identity, absolute certainty, where everyone outside your circle is cast as an enemy or fool. That's the inheritance. What medieval Iberians couldn't sustain under pressure is what we're being asked to sustain now, at scale. The pattern is clear. Plurality under pressure generates friction, but friction also generates innovation, and translation between traditions forces precision, while negotiation forces clear articulation. Underneath this, the necessity of working across frameworks in tension also forces you to understand your own framework better. But that capacity of understanding is hard to come by, harder to sustain, and almost impossible to hold when pressure mounts. Each generation has to choose it again, consciously, against the constant pull towards simplicity. Medieval Iberia eventually chose simplicity, or had it imposed. The cost was enormous, not just for the expelled and the converted, but for Iberian culture itself. It lost the cross-cultural engine that had driven so much of its most distinctive creative life. The creativity lived in the productive tension. Once the tension was resolved, the creativity went with it. Here's where the history turns personal. What medieval Iberia faced at the scale of civilization, you face at the scale of a single mind. You live among more competing perspectives, frameworks, and narratives than any generation before you, and holding them is hard in exactly the way it was hard for the translator in Toledo. It asks you to keep your footing while encountering wildly diverse traditions and trains of thought. This is what Robert L. Moore called the capacity of the magician, the ability to move between systems of thought and understand without merging and without rejecting, to hold complexity without collapsing into it. Moore was clear that this capacity isn't automatic. It comes through initiation and has to be trained, modeled, and practiced. Left to ourselves under pressure, we fall into one of its shadows. The manipulator learns the other position only to defeat it. This is knowledge as a weapon, never a bridge. The denying innocent one refuses to learn it at all, the door shut before it even opens, and the tyrant faced with complexity simply crushes it. Iberia ran all three at a civilizational scale and paid for them. You run them in miniature every day. So here's your challenge. Identify one domain where you've collapsed complexity into simple answers because holding plurality is too difficult. It might be political. You've decided everyone on that side is wrong because engaging with actual complexity is exhausting. Maybe it's personal. You've written someone off entirely rather than engaging with how they think. Or it might be intellectual. You've dismissed an entire field without seriously studying it on its own terms. Pick one, just one. Try to find the most compelling version of the position you've dismissed, not the straw man. If it's political, read serious thinkers from that tradition. If it's personal, actually ask that person to explain their thinking, not to argue but to understand. If it's intellectual, study the foundational texts, not just critiques. Then notice, does understanding it destroy your position? That tells you something about how solid your own framework was. Or does it strengthen your position because you now know where the real disagreements are? The medieval Iberians who succeeded in holding plurality didn't abandon their identities. Jewish scholars remained Jews. Muslim physicians remained Muslims. Christian knights remained Christians. They strengthened their identities while navigating complexity. They kept strong centers and permeable boundaries. The ones who failed either merged into formlessness or hardened into rigidity, identity through negation, defined only by opposition. Document what you have learned, and you can share what you found in the comments. Don't share your starting position, but share your ending understanding. What did you discover? What changed? The next 2 episodes will be the first character portrait of the channel. We will embark on the first crusade with the great Occitan lord, Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse. Siat Gaillard, be strong in Occitan, as one subscriber wrote me. And as always, thank you for watching.